we left off, Billy Costa had just been nabbed by the Gobblers. We've already covered several of the scenes which follow this in the BBC show, so we'll skip back a bit and pick up with Lyra learning about Billy's kidnapping. Instead of having her learn about it from Roger over breakfast though, let's bring Lyra back out into the Oxford streets. In the book, she learns about the disappearance directly from Mark Costa, who's busy beating senseless anyone stupid enough to be caught not looking for Billy. Here's an extract in which Lyra is assessing the situation. In the tight-knit Gyptian boat world, all children were precious and extravagantly loved, and a mother knew that if her child was out of her sight, it wouldn't be far from someone else's, who would protect it instinctively. But here was Mark Costa, a queen among the Gyptians, in a terror for a missing child. What was going on? Now, it might seem odd to have to make a point of Mark Costa being frightened for her missing child, but there are a couple of little details in this section which I think are worth including. The first is that it shows that Mark Costa has her finger on the pulse. She's quite high-ranking among the Gyptians, so she's aware of the rumoured Gobblers and knows that children are going missing up and down the country, while in the show she reassures herself with other explanations.
He's just lost his way, and he needs us to find him.
In the book, she's clued up enough to be immediately worried that Billy's been taken. Including this in our version will, I think, give her a stronger and more active role in the search for Billy, rather than sitting and fretting while the others do the looking. The other thing the above extract proves is that Lyra is familiar enough with the Gyptians to realise that something out of the ordinary is going on, an astute observation which shows us just how sharp she is. Again, worth including, so we'll convey this through dialogue between Lyra and Pan, or maybe Roger, who might as well be here too, because the more time they spend together early in the story the better, for reasons that will become clear later. So next we can have a scene in which Lyra organises the Gyptian kids into search parties, and we see her in full-on commander mode. We've already suggested her leadership qualities in the mudfight last episode, but it won't hurt to cement them. I want to talk briefly about Lyra's voice, or more specifically, her dialect. In the show she has a very clipped, clean accent, no doubt designed to be palatable in the States.
I've told you, the Gobblers are a myth, Roger. They don't exist. The Gyptians will find Billy.
Which, you know, is fine, but in the book she has a much more grounded, lax way of speaking, full of ents and ems and alls, which is picked up from the kids she hangs around with. Here's an example from when Roger asks if she believes in Gobblers. I do, but I ain't afraid either. I just do what my uncle done last time he came to Jordan. I seen him. He was in the retiring room, and there was this guest who weren't polite, and my uncle just gave him a hard look and the man fell dead. As I said in the last episode, I think it's a shame to sanitise Lyra, because it's her rough edges that set her apart from the stoic, heroic Katniss Everdeen or book-smart goody-two-shoes Hermione Granger. No disrespect, but Lyra could probably eat the likes of Hermione for breakfast. Magic notwithstanding, of course. Having said that, I reckon it'd be a really nice touch if she brought out her posh accent for adult conversation. One of her key attributes is that she's a very accomplished liar, and chameleonic social habits would reinforce this. Anyway, back to the story. Let's underline the sense of dread amongst the Gyptians when, after a bit of Lyra marshalling troops, the Gyptian kids are gradually gathered up by their parents and confined to narrowboats, while the adults start seriously organising themselves to search for Billy. This is when Father Coram arrives on the scene. It would be interesting if he crossed paths with Lyra briefly, just long enough to give her a second look. I don't want to get spoilery, but for various reasons, suggesting that Coram knows about Lyra would be a good little detail to include, for the sake of foreshadowing. I'd like to work a little motif into this episode of adult characters knowing more than they're letting on and being concerned about Lyra in a way that the audience can pick up on while Lyra doesn't. I think it could create an ominous sense that powerful forces are starting to shift. I might contrast well with the previous episode's theme of adult characters seeming untrustworthy or hampering Lyra in some way. Hopefully this would give a nice little arc, at least in terms of the audience's understanding, to those characters we don't see after Lyra leaves Jordan. So we can follow Father Coram into the meeting with the Gyptians, which can play out much as it does in the show, with one big exception. John Farr isn't going to be here in our version. John Farr is Lord of the Western Gyptians, the big cheese. So if Gyptian children are missing from all over, why would he come to Oxford? In the show, John Farr's apparently travelled to Oxford, only for Coram to say,
"The Gobblers will have got him out of Oxford by now. We have word they are taking the children to London."
If that's the case, it makes more sense for Coram to be doing the rounds and mobilising the Gyptians to go and search in London, while Farr is elsewhere running things from the top. Besides, I think it's a good idea to keep John Farr somewhere aloft for the time being, to establish his status ready for when we finally do meet him. There are actually two scenes in the show concerning the search for Billy, but they both serve essentially the same purpose. So if we include Mark Costa in this version of the scene, rather than having her
wait on a boat in case Billy returns there,
we can roll them both into one. Having the decision to search in London already made, rather than waiting an extra day, would make Coram and the Gyptian leaders come across as just that bit more decisive. Perhaps in the face of Mark Costa's arguments, Coram can concede to giving them the rest of the day to search Oxford, but insist that they're going to leave in the evening. With her Gyptian mates otherwise engaged, Lyra can return to Jordan. Once again, Mrs Lonsdale's looking for her. Lyra's to dine at the master's table tonight, so she needs to get ready. We can contrast this scene with the similar one in the previous episode by having Mrs Lonsdale be a bit softer and on edge, as if she's worried about something, to suggest that she has some awareness of what's going on. It's important, I think, to use both this scene and the one in the last episode to prove that Lyra is generally left to look after herself, except under special circumstances. Perhaps Mrs Lonsdale can comment on Lyra not doing her washing for ages, or saying you haven't hung anything up in weeks. By now we've come to the point in the BBC show that introduces us to the members of the Magisterium, specifically Lord Boreal and Father MacPhail. I'm in two minds about including this scene. On the one hand, I can see the value of having villains introduced early on, even if they don't take an active role in the story until much later. But on the other hand, as discussed last episode, I like the fact that the scope of the story is narrow early on and gradually expands as Lyra sees more of the world. But I guess she's at least aware of the Magisterium, and that they're aligned against her uncle, so let's keep it in. However, let's not have them refer directly to this her they talk about, because I want to change how we introduce Mrs Coulter. In the book, when we first meet Mrs Coulter, we recognise her as one of the gobblers because of her golden monkey demon, who features in Tony Macarius' kidnapping. In the show, we get introduced to her like this. Now that's very clearly a villain's introduction, but without any villainous action to back it up. We're simply told she's bad. I feel like this is a missed opportunity, since Lyra doesn't know she's bad, and there will be viewers who aren't familiar with the book, so why not keep her ambiguous for now? Okay, she proves herself to be evil pretty quickly, but it might as well be a surprise to those who don't know it's coming. You know, I bet there were some people who didn't see Saruman's betrayal at the start of Fellowship coming, and you know, good for them. I wouldn't take that away from them, even if the rest of the audience is thinking, come on Gandalf, of course he's evil, dude looks like Christopher Lee. Anyway, let's introduce Coulter in a more innocuous way. Or maybe we could just have Lyra introduce her at the dinner. This scene can play out pretty much as it does in the show, maybe with a bit more emphasis on Lyra's instant fascination with Coulter, which doesn't really come through in the show except for when she ignores Roger. Following the dinner, Mrs Coulter takes Lyra aside and invites her to live with her in London, sweetening the deal with the possibility that she might take Lyra exploring too. In the book, it's the Master who gives Lyra the news, but I think this is a sensible change. Another good change is the fact that Roger being taken by the Gobblers is a consequence of Lyra asking if he can go to London too. In the book he simply disappears, before Coulter's even on the scene. It's a bit too much of a coincidence for me that Lyra's bestie is one of the missing kids. So this cause and effect variation on the story works well. The show then cuts away to a kind of nothing scene with Tony and Mar Costa. Let's replace this with a sequence in which the Gyptians are setting sail for London. Perhaps another exchange between Father Coram and Mar Costa, in which Coram tries to persuade Mar Costa that they aren't giving up on Billy by leaving. Quite the opposite, in fact. The following morning, Lyra is woken early, not by the librarian, but by Mrs Lonsdale, who doesn't say,
"Who were you expecting at this hour?"
because you literally just woke her up and she clearly wasn't expecting anything, you plonker. Lyra's told to hurry over to the Master's lodging, where he gives her the Alethiometer. This is the point where Lyra's story takes on a bittersweet tone. The people who have cared for her all her life are frightened on her behalf and sad to see her leave, but she's too excited to notice. "Aren't I going after all?" Lyra asks when she gets to the Master's study. "Yes, I can't prevent it," says the Master, and Lyra didn't notice at the time what an odd thing that was to say. I feel like it might just twist the knife a bit, to have the likes of the Master, the Librarian and Mrs Lonsdale expressing their love for Lyra in small ways, but having it go straight over Lyra's head. We can keep this scene more or less the same, but I'd remove this moment.
I don't want secrets.
Because really, Lyra loves a good secret. I do think it makes sense to include the Librarian, so he gets his chance to say goodbye. Maybe we could expand on this small beat after Lyra leaves, and have the two old men attempt to reassure each other, or at least try to accept that it's out of their hands. Then Lyra notices that Roger's missing, and she can go searching for him in the same way she does in the show. This little montage that proves that she knows everyone in the college is a good touch. Perhaps we should have included something similar in the first episode. Anyhow, after a bit of searching, Lyra runs into Mrs Coulter. I quite like this scene, apart from the weird moment when Coulter says,
Not here, Lyra.
before stepping about 10 feet to the right and carrying on the conversation. The scene gives Coulter a chance to show off her powers of manipulation, the best lies containing an
Element of truth.
and all that. Remember that some viewers in theory won't know that she's evil yet. She allows Lyra to believe that she's making her own decisions. Lyra's actually still got the Alethiometer in her pocket during this scene, so it's a shame that its presence isn't felt. If we were to include a line from Coulter that reminds Lyra of it, then we can see the golden monkey pick up on that, in the same way he does in the airship later. So Lyra's in a bind, struggling to make a decision and getting frustrated. Since she's just been reminded about the Alethiometer, this will lead nicely into the scene where she tries to work it for the first time. Let's set it somewhere other than her bedroom though, since Mrs Lonsdale is going to be in there packing her bags. In the book, Lyra's already been looking for Roger when Mrs Lonsdale is getting her ready to go to dinner. There's a nice little exchange here which we can use in this packing scene. Lyra accuses Mrs Lonsdale of not caring about Roger, to which Mrs Lonsdale says, "None of that nonsense. I'm a Parslow, same as Roger's father. Don't you chide me with not caring about the boy. God knows knows I even care about you, and you give me little enough reason and no thanks. I don't think Mrs. Lonsdale would go so far as to give Lyra a hug, but perhaps she'd take a moment to brush Lyra's hair or something, for old time's sake. She can give a hard sniff, just as Lyra leaves, which suggests she's as close to shedding a tear as she's ever been. Lyra rushes off to catch the airship, which in our version will be full of people with demons. Okay, sorry, I said I wasn't going to do that. In the show, Lyra very nearly misses the airship, jumping on at the last second. I don't think this is a risk Mrs. Coulter would run. It would be good to have her give the conductor a little nod after Lyra gets on board, to imply that she's had the departure delayed, a little demonstration to the audience of Coulter's power. For one final little adjustment, let's have the golden monkey staring intently at the pocket the alethiometer's hidden in, but let's put a bit more emphasis on Pan noticing this, to differentiate it from the earlier scene in the corridor. And so, as Lyra leaves Oxford in the company of Mrs. Coulter, we come to the end of episode 2. Okay, there were quite a lot of tangents going on in all that, so let's have a recap. Lyra and Roger are down by the boatyard, where they learn of Billy's disappearance from Mark Costa. Lyra demonstrates her leadership skills by organising the Gyptian kid into search parties, and when Father Coram arrives we get a hint that he knows about Lyra. We give Mark Costa a more active role in the search for Billy, and demonstrate her status in the Gyptian world by including him in the scene with Father Coram marshalling the Gyptians. He's acting on Lord Farr's orders, but Farr isn't actually present. With her search efforts interrupted, Lyra returns to Jordan, where Mrs. Lonsdale, who's worried about something, gets her ready for dinner with the Master. There's a brief scene in which we meet Lord Boreal and Father MacPhail before we're introduced to Mrs. Coulter in a way that doesn't immediately show that she's evil. Lyra's fascinated by Mrs. Coulter, while the other adults around are anxious, and Mrs. Coulter then invites Lyra to be her assistant. Roger gets taken by the gobblers, as a result of Lyra wanting him to go with her. Then we rejoin the Gyptians briefly as they prepare to leave for London. The following morning, Mrs. Lonsdale wakes Lyra so that she can meet the Master and receive the Alethiometer, and we reiterate the Master and the Librarian's fears. Then Lyra realises Roger's missing and goes looking for him. Nobody seems to care except Mrs. Coulter, who convinces Lyra that London is the best place to look for him anyway. Lyra tries out the Alethiometer for the first time, while Mrs. Lonsdale packs her bags and sadly sees her off. The episode ends as Lyra leaves Oxford behind her. Thanks for watching. Do let me know your thoughts in the comments. Give the video a like if you like, and subscribe if you want to follow along. I'll see you next time.